June 4, 1942. 300 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly under a blazing sun as radio operator First Class Petty Officer Thomas B. Gay crouched in the cramped communications compartment of the USS Yorktown. The 22-year-old Navajo Marine adjusted his headset, sweat beading on his forehead, as he prepared to transmit what would become the most crucial message in naval history. Around him, steel bulkheads vibrated with the constant hum of engines, pushing the carrier toward an encounter that would determine the fate of the Pacific. Japanese Admiral Nagumo's First Air Fleet, the same force that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, was bearing down on American positions with 4 massive aircraft carriers and over 250 warplanes. What the Japanese High Command didn't know was that their supposedly unbreakable naval codes had been compromised, and American codebreakers had been reading their communications for weeks. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. By the end of this day, a language that had never been written down, spoken by fewer than 50,000 people on a remote reservation in the American Southwest, would single-handedly turn the tide of the war in the Pacific and send 4 of Japan's most powerful warships to the bottom of the ocean. Thomas Begay had grown up speaking Diné Bizard, the Navajo language, in a small hogan near Window Rock, Arizona. His grandfather, John Begay, had survived the Long Walk of 1864 when the U.S. Army forced 8,000 Navajo people from their ancestral homeland to an internment camp at Bosque Redondo, New Mexico. 3 generations later, Thomas found himself wearing the uniform of that same army. But now his heritage would become America's greatest weapon against a different enemy. The concept of using Native American languages for military communications wasn't entirely new. During the First World War, Cherokee and Choctaw soldiers had occasionally used their tribal languages for battlefield communications, but those efforts had been spontaneous and limited in scope. What was about to unfold in the Pacific represented something far more sophisticated and systematic. Marine Corps cryptographer Colonel James Jones had been wrestling with a critical problem for months. Japanese intelligence services had proven remarkably adept at intercepting and decoding American radio transmissions. Every major operation seemed to be anticipated. Every strategic movement counted before it could achieve surprise. American casualties were mounting as Japanese forces consistently appeared prepared for attacks that should have caught them off guard. Jones had studied linguistics at Yale University before the war and understood that truly secure communication required more than just substitution codes or mechanical encryption devices. The Japanese had captured American equipment and codebooks. They had recruited English-speaking interpreters. They had even managed to infiltrate some communications networks with their own operators, who could mimic American radio procedures with frightening accuracy. The solution came from an unexpected source. In February 1942, Jones attended a demonstration at Camp Elliott, California, where Philip Johnston, a civil engineer who had grown up on the Navajo reservation as the son of missionaries, proposed using the Navajo language as the foundation for an unbreakable military code. Johnston explained that Navajo was what linguists called a tonal language, where meaning changed based on subtle variations in pitch and inflection. The language contained sounds that simply didn't exist in Japanese, German, or most other world languages. More importantly, Navajo had no written alphabet or standardized orthography. Even if Japanese cryptographers managed to record Navajo transmissions, they would have no linguistic framework for analysis. But Johnston's most compelling argument wasn't about the language's complexity. It was about accessibility. Outside of the Navajo Nation, fewer than 30 non-Navajos in the entire world spoke the language fluently. The chances of Japanese forces having access to a Navajo interpreter were essentially zero. Marine Corps leadership authorized an immediate test. 4 Navajo volunteers, including Thomas Begay and his cousin Samuel Begay, were brought to Camp Elliott and given a series of typical military messages to encode and transmit using their native language. The results were remarkable. Messages that took 30 minutes to encode using standard military encryption could be transmitted in Navajo and decoded in under 3 minutes. However, the Marines quickly discovered that simply speaking Navajo wasn't sufficient for military communication. The language lacked words for modern military equipment and tactical concepts. Tank, submarine, aircraft carrier, artillery, and hundreds of other essential military terms had no direct Navajo equivalents. The solution required both linguistic creativity and cultural insight. Working with tribal elders and Marine Corps communications specialists, the Navajo volunteers developed an elegant dual-layer code system that would prove absolutely unbreakable throughout the war. The first layer involved creating Navajo terms for military equipment based on traditional Navajo concepts and observations. Aircraft became Wo-ta-dene-i, which meant the one that flies. Submarines became Beshlo, meaning ironfish. Aircraft carriers were designated Tsidi-mofa-yehi, literally bird carriers. But the code talkers went further, developing specific terms for different types of aircraft based on their characteristics as observed through Navajo cultural perspective. Fighter planes became Dahitihi, meaning hummingbird, because of their speed and maneuverability. Bombers were called Jay-shodifu, meaning buzzard, because they circled high before striking their targets. The second layer involved a substitution alphabet, where important words were spelled out, using Navajo words that began with corresponding English letters. The word navy might be transmitted as Tsahadzo, Wallachi, Akediglini, Tsahadzo Gloi, using the Navajo words for needle, ant, victor, needle, and dog to spell Navy. This dual system meant that even if Japanese cryptographers somehow acquired a Navajo speaker, the military-specific vocabulary and secondary substitution system would still render the transmissions incomprehensible. By May 1942, Thomas Bigay and 28 other Navajo Marines had completed their training and were assigned to Pacific Fleet communications units. They had memorized over 200 military terms in their specialized code and could transmit complex operational orders with unprecedented speed and security. The first major test of the Navajo code came during the intelligence preparations for the Battle of Midway. American code breakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had partially broken Japanese naval codes and determined that a major assault was planned for early June. However, Japanese communications referred to the target only as AF, and American commanders needed to confirm that AF meant Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, Chief of Pacific Fleet Intelligence, devised an elegant deception. He ordered Midway's garrison to transmit an uncoded message reporting that their water purification plant had malfunctioned and requesting emergency fresh water supplies. Within 24 hours, Japanese intelligence intercepted and relayed a coded message reporting that AF is short of fresh water. With Midway confirmed as the Japanese target, Admiral Chester Nimitz began positioning his available forces for what would become the most decisive naval engagement in Pacific history. The Americans would field 3 aircraft carriers against 4 Japanese carriers, but they would have the advantages of advance warning, carefully chosen defensive positions, and completely secure communications. On the morning of June 4th, Thomas Bigay found himself in the communications center of the USS Yorktown as Admiral Frank Fletcher's Task Force 17 moved into position northeast of Midway. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had been spotted at dawn, and both fleets were now aware of each other's approximate positions. The battle that would determine control of the Central Pacific was about to begin. At 0730 hours, radar operators aboard Yorktown detected incoming Japanese aircraft at a distance of 93 miles. Lieutenant Commander John Thatcher's Fighting Squadron 3 was launched immediately, followed by dive bombers and torpedo planes that would attempt to locate and attack the Japanese carriers. Thomas Bigay's role became crucial as American strike groups attempted to coordinate their attacks. Traditional military radio communications were proving inadequate for the complex, rapidly evolving tactical situation. American pilots were scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean, searching for Japanese carriers while avoiding enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Using the Navajo code, Thomas transmitted targeting information and tactical updates that allowed scattered American squadrons to concentrate their attacks at the precise moment when Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. At 0925 hours, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers located the Japanese carriers Kaga and Akagi in the midst of refueling and rearming operations. The timing was perfect and catastrophic for the Japanese. Aircraft were spotted on deck, with fuel lines connected and ordnance stacked nearby. McCluskey's dive bombers achieved complete surprise, and their attacks triggered secondary explosions that turned both carriers into infernos within minutes. Simultaneously, other American squadrons located and attacked the carriers Soryu and Hiryu. Thomas B. Gay transmitted damage assessments and targeting corrections that enabled follow-up strikes to finish off the wounded Japanese ships. By the end of the day, all 4 Japanese carriers had been defeated, along with most of their experienced pilots and aircraft. The Japanese defeat at Midway was so complete that Admiral Yamamoto immediately ordered his remaining forces to withdraw toward Japan. The Imperial Navy had lost not just 4 aircraft carriers, but the strategic initiative in the Pacific. American forces would now begin the long advance toward Japan itself. But perhaps more importantly, from a communications perspective, Japanese intelligence services had recorded hours of radio transmissions during the battle and could make no sense of them whatsoever. Cryptographers in Tokyo analyzed the recordings for months, searching for patterns or familiar linguistic elements. They found nothing recognizable. Captain Yahachi Tanabe, one of Japan's most experienced communications intelligence officers, later wrote in his personal diary that the American transmissions seemed to follow no known linguistic or cryptographic patterns. "It is as if the Americans have learned to speak with the voices of spirits," he noted with obvious frustration. Unknown to Tanabe and his colleagues, they were encountering a language that had developed in complete isolation from Indo-European, Sino-Tibetan, and all other major language families. Navajo belonged to the Athabascan language group, which had diverged from other human languages thousands of years ago when the ancestors of the Navajo people migrated across the Bering Land Bridge into North America. The linguistic isolation that had once made the Navajo people vulnerable to cultural suppression now made their language impenetrable to enemy codebreakers. Every grammatical structure, every phoneme, every semantic concept was utterly foreign to Japanese linguistic analysis. Following the success at Midway, the Marine Corps rapidly expanded the Code Talker program. By August 1942, over 200 Navajo Marines had been trained in the specialized communication system. They were assigned to every major amphibious operation in the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. Thomas B. Gay participated in landings at Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Saipan, and finally Okinawa. In each operation, Navajo Communications provided American commanders with the tactical flexibility that proved decisive in complex amphibious warfare. Coordination between naval gunfire, air support, and ground forces required split-second timing and absolute communication security. The Code Talkers delivered both. During the Saipan operation in June 1944, Thomas found himself coordinating close air support for Marines pinned down by Japanese positions in the island's mountainous interior. Using the Navajo code, he was able to direct Navy and Marine Corps aircraft to targets within 50 yards of American positions, something that would have been impossible with conventional radio procedures that Japanese forces had learned to exploit. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was as significant as the tactical advantages. Intercepted American radio transmissions had become incomprehensible, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and paranoia within Japanese command structures. Officers could no longer anticipate American movements or prepare effective countermeasures. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding Japanese forces on Iwo Jima, noted in his correspondence to Imperial General Headquarters that American forces seemed to possess supernatural coordination between different units and services. He attributed much of the American tactical superiority to their mysterious communication methods. What Kuribayashi couldn't know was that his observation was literally correct. From the Japanese perspective, American forces had indeed acquired a supernatural ability to coordinate complex operations in real time, without revealing their intentions to enemy intelligence services. The Code Talkers' most remarkable achievement might have been their speed and accuracy under combat conditions. During the height of the Okinawa campaign, Thomas Begay and his communication team transmitted over 800 messages in a 72-hour period without a single error or security breach. Conventional encryption methods would have required a staff of dozens of specialists and would still have been vulnerable to Japanese cryptographic analysis. Beyond their technical accomplishments, the code talkers represented a profound irony in American military history. Many of the Navajo Marines had attended government boarding schools where they had been punished for speaking their native language as part of federal policies designed to eliminate Native American cultural identity. Now that same language was protecting American forces and hastening the defeat of fascist regimes that sought to impose their own cultural supremacy on conquered peoples. Thomas Begay reflected on this irony in a letter to his grandfather, written from Okinawa in June 1945. The same words they tried to take from us in school are now the words that help us protect our country, he wrote in Navajo. Perhaps the Creator intended for our language to serve this purpose when our people first learned to speak. The strategic impact of the code talkers extended far beyond individual battles or campaigns. Secure communications enabled American forces to implement complex, multi-stage operations that would have been impossible without absolute confidence in communication security. The island-hopping strategy that characterized American advance across the Pacific depended on precise coordination between naval, air, and ground forces operating across vast distances. Each amphibious assault required months of planning and involved dozens of separate military units. Intelligence had to be gathered and distributed. Naval bombardment needed to be coordinated with airstrikes. Landing schedules had to be synchronized with tide tables and weather conditions. Supply requirements had to be calculated and logistics arranged. All of this coordination depended on communications that the enemy could not intercept and decode. The Navajo Code provided the communication security that made such complex operations feasible. American planners could discuss detailed operational plans over radio networks without fear of compromise. Field commanders could request support and report situation changes in real time without alerting enemy forces to American intentions or capabilities. Japanese military leadership gradually became aware that American communication security had improved dramatically. But they never discovered the source of that improvement. Interrogation of captured American personnel revealed nothing useful, since most prisoners were unaware that Navajo code talkers were operating in their units. The Marines had been trained to work quietly and avoid drawing attention to their specialized role. Even when Japanese forces managed to capture American radio equipment, they gained no insight into American communication methods. The Navajo Code wasn't dependent on mechanical devices or written materials that could be analyzed. It existed entirely in the minds and cultural memory of the code talkers themselves. Some Japanese intelligence officers theorized that Americans had developed a new type of encryption machine, possibly based on technologies captured from German forces. Others suspected that American communications were being routed through secret relay stations that somehow transformed recognizable English into incomprehensible signals. The reality was far simpler and more elegant. American forces had found their unbreakable code in the oral tradition of a people whose language had been shaped by centuries of life in the high desert of the American Southwest, far from the linguistic influences that had affected most other human languages. As the war moved into its final phase, Thomas Begay and the other code talkers found themselves supporting operations that were bringing American forces ever closer to the Japanese home islands. The captured airfields and harbors that they had helped secure were now serving as bases for massive bombing campaigns against Japanese industrial centers. The irony was profound. The same communication superiority that had enabled American forces to defeat Japanese carriers at Midway was now enabling strategic bombing campaigns that were systematically eliminating Japan's capacity to continue the war. Navajo words spoken into radio microphones on remote Pacific atolls were helping to coordinate the industrial and logistical efforts that would ultimately force Japanese surrender. On August 15, 1945, Thomas Begay was monitoring communications aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender over Japanese radio networks. The war was over, and the code talkers had transmitted their final military messages. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Code Talker program was classified at the highest levels of military security. The Marines who had served as Code Talkers were ordered not to discuss their wartime roles, and most details of the program remained secret for decades. Military planners recognized that the Navajo Code might prove valuable in future conflicts and wanted to preserve its security. Thomas B. Gay returned to the Navajo Nation and used his military education benefits to attend college, eventually becoming a teacher on the reservation. For 23 years, he never spoke publicly about his wartime service, honoring the oath of secrecy he had taken as a Marine. When the Code Talker program was finally declassified in 1968, the American public learned for the first time about the role that Navajo Marines had played in Pacific victory. Historians began to recognize that the Code Talkers had provided one of the most significant intelligence advantages of the entire war. Military cryptographers who analyzed the Navajo Code after its declassification confirmed what battlefield experience had already demonstrated. The code was indeed unbreakable by conventional cryptographic methods. The combination of linguistic isolation, cultural specificity, and military adaptation had created a communication system that no enemy could penetrate. The success of the Navajo Code Talkers inspired similar programs during later conflicts. Cherokee, Comanche, and other tribal languages were used during the Korean and Vietnam Wars, though none achieved the scale or success of the original Navajo program. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the Code Talkers was their demonstration that cultural diversity could serve as a source of national strength rather than weakness. The same linguistic and cultural differences that had made Native Americans targets of assimilation policies proved to be invaluable assets in defending American democratic values against totalitarian enemies. Thomas Begay lived to see the Code Talkers receive formal recognition for their service. In 2001, the original 29 Navajo Code Talkers received Congressional Gold Medals, the highest civilian honor that Congress can award. Thomas was present at the White House ceremony, now an elderly man reflecting on how his grandfather's language had helped change the course of world history. During his acceptance speech, Thomas noted that the Code Talkers had served not just their country, but all people who believed in freedom and human dignity. "Our words became weapons against those who would silence other voices," he said. "Perhaps that is what our ancestors always intended when they taught us to speak with precision and to listen with wisdom." The strategic impact of the Navajo Code Talkers extended far beyond the battles they directly influenced. Their success demonstrated that victory in modern warfare depended not just on industrial production or technological sophistication, but on the creative use of all available human resources. The Marines who discovered the potential of the Navajo language were thinking outside conventional military frameworks and recognizing assets that others had overlooked. In many ways, the Code Talkers represented the democratic ideals for which the war was being fought. They were citizen soldiers who brought their unique cultural heritage into service of the broader national effort. Their success proved that America's strength lay not in cultural uniformity, but in the creative synthesis of diverse traditions and capabilities. The Japanese failure to break the Navajo Code also illustrated the limitations of their own intelligence services. Japanese cryptographers were highly skilled and had achieved significant successes against other Allied communication systems. But their training and experience were rooted in conventional approaches to code breaking that assumed all human languages shared certain fundamental characteristics. The Japanese had never encountered a language like Navajo, which had developed in complete isolation from the linguistic traditions they understood. Their failure wasn't due to lack of effort or intelligence, but to the limitations of their conceptual framework. They were trying to solve a problem using tools that were simply inadequate for the task. This cognitive limitation reflected broader weaknesses in Japanese strategic thinking during the war. Japanese leadership consistently underestimated American industrial capacity, technological innovation, and cultural adaptability. They assumed that American society was too diverse and individualistic to sustain a prolonged war effort against a more disciplined and unified enemy. The success of the Code Talkers proved exactly the opposite. American diversity became a source of unexpected capabilities that Japanese planners couldn't anticipate or counter. The very cultural complexity that Japanese propaganda portrayed as American weakness became one of America's most decisive advantages. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.